This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome back to this week's Killer Innovations. I'm your host, Phil McKinney. We are on the road in the mobile studio. We are actually currently in Florida, getting ready to do some work here. And then after the holidays, we will begin heading west towards Las Vegas for the Consumer Electronics Show. So depending on when you hear this, it could be past this time frame when we're in CES. But if you're going to be in the Consumer Electronics Show this year in Las Vegas, love to have you stop by, check out the mobile studio, meet with us, get a chance to meet you, hear your story, and if it's appropriate, we'd love to even think about maybe even having you on the show as a guest. So reach out, drop me a note at phil@killerinnovations.com. So this week's show, we're going to talk about what I call innovation reform. Now, innovation reform is something, it's kind of putting a label on something that I've been ranting and raving on here, probably for the last year or so. But let me back up and let me set the context here. When you're going to reform something, your objective is to change it for the better. If you take parts of reform, you can see that it means to shape again. We often use to talk about correcting what's wrong in a system. If you reform something, you're trying to make it better, to make it fairer. I mean, is that a word? Fairer? But you're trying to change it for the better, to make it better for everybody. Now, our history has said that reform has come around in cycles. There's been multiple reforms. The one term that gets attached to reforming is Wall Street. And now Wall Street has been reformed through government regulation. It's been sometimes referred to as financial reform. And it refers to the form of the financial industry through regulation. And Wall Street is has been gone through this for many, many, many years. There's been major Wall Street reform bills, including the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, the Truth in Lending Act in 1968, the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, and even the most recent Wall Street Reform Bill, which is the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which went into place in 2010. So there's been this attempt to correct challenges or problems in a given area, in this case Wall Street or the financial industry, through regulation and trying to put in place rules and laws and trying to think through all the bad things that somebody can do and then put those regulations in place. So in this case, reform is being driven through policies, procedures, regulatory laws put in place by governments in order to reform. Reform meaning I'm going to make it better. It's been doing something wrong. I'm going to make it better, and I'm going to do that through some form of government action. Now, there's a cataract to reform, and that is to actually go the opposite direction, deregulate. So economic reform, the term economic reform or microeconomic reform, comprises of policies to achieve improvements in economic efficiency, either by eliminating or reducing the distortions in the economy, by reforming the policies such as tax policy or competition law. The economic reform usually refers to deregulation, removing the artificial distortions. As the old saying goes, with government, there's always these unintended consequences. So in this case, there's a deregulation view of reform. So in this case, remove those distortions, remove those regulations, And then rather than increasing it, get rid of it, remove it in order to let the market take over. As such, these reform policies are the tradition of really what they refer to as a laissez-faire, emphasizing that there's distortions caused by government, these unintended consequences. And rather than emphasizing the need for state regulations to maximize efficiency, get the government out. So this is probably, though, the two approaches. When I say the word reform, it's probably the first thing that comes to mind. Wall Street reform, medical reform, economic reform. You're trying to change something to make it better. Now, these are two radically different approaches to reform. The objective, though, is to make things better. Did you think any of the two above made things better? I mean, if you look through that list again of all of the Wall Street reforms, the Federal Reserve Act, Glass-Steagall Act, Truth in Lending Act, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act of 1989, Sarbanes-Oxley, there's just been piling on of these regulations to try to reform. And again, reform is to make it better. Did any of those make things better? It's really open to different opinions. It's what do you think? What do you believe? Now, does innovation need reforming? What is wrong with innovation? Can something as nebulous as innovation be reformed? Now, there's other things that have been kind of nebulous and soft and feely, squishy, that have also been reformed. In the 1800s, here in the United States, there was a reform movement in religion. The focus was to change or transform or make it better. So the question is does innovation need reforming? Now, the soft, feely, kind of squishy part of innovation, like what is it and what is it I want to make better? What is it that I want to transform and change in order to enhance innovation? Now, the reason I get so wound up on this and it's become such a hot button issue for me is there have been the misuse of innovation. There has been the misrepresentation of innovation in order for people to make personal financial gains or to mislead or a whole variety of things. In addition, because of the way innovation gets treated, even in the hard areas of things like finance, it gets overlooked. It gets minimized from the standpoint of support of funding and investment. Just look at what's happening in the U.S. government, which historically has been this massive investor in new areas of new technologies on the government side, which then comes across and has a huge positive impact when it comes to the commercial side. It's that commercialization effort of those things coming across. And if you look at total government spending, not only in the U.S., but around the world, it has actually been on somewhat of a decline in a number of Western economies. Now, there are still other economies that are growing their innovation spend, their R&D spend, China being one of those. But when you think about innovation reform is how do we think differently about it? What is the proper role that innovation plays in our day-to-day lives? And where those things maybe aren't done right or aren't working out correctly, you do need to reform them. And in many cases, it's the reform of thinking, reform of thought. How do we classify it? How do we deal with it? How do we put it in its proper context? How do we leverage it to solve our biggest social issues and challenges that we face as a society? We tend to just think about innovation as the new gadget, shiny object that comes out from a leading supplier like Apple or Samsung or HP or Dell or IBM. But when in reality, innovation plays a much more fundamental role in our day-to-day lives. And it's that continuous role of innovation, solving the biggest challenges such as education, healthcare, government, politics, elections, societal communications, of sharing thoughts and ideas across the globe, enabling us to become one rather than dividing us. There's a role of innovation to address all of these biggest challenges that we have. So, back to my fundamental question here is, does innovation need reforming? If so, which approach? Is there regulation that should be applied to innovation, or structuring other incentives to encourage doing the right thing, or some other completely different approach never before considered around how do you reform innovation to put it in its proper context? And with that, we're going to cover this in today's show, and we'll have more on this after the break. Does innovation need reforming? Now remember, reforming is about correcting what's wrong in a system, and if you reform something, you are attempting to make it better and fair for everyone. So what is wrong with innovation that requires reforming? I'm going to present 3 areas that I think, as innovators, as those of us engaged in the innovation economy, driving innovation, being involved in what I call the innovation game for so long, I think there are 3 areas that those of us innovators, I need to be thinking about. Number 1, unethical or misleading innovation. This is this whole explosion of activities more recently where people have presented innovations but have been totally unethical and have been misleading investors and the public, and in some cases actually putting people's lives at risks around false innovation. For example, Theranos, promising to do blood tests with a single drop of blood. They actually installed these machines into Walgreens, gave people the wrong results, and it caused people to change whether or not they needed to go to the doctor, were they at risk of their cancer coming back, etc. Right? So that's just one. And they lied to the press. There's been a huge amount of activities around them, and there's a movie, etc. So Theranos is just the one example, but there have been many, many others. The other is academic research being retracted. If you look at how much academic research has been retracted in the last handful of years, it is a growing number. I started tracking this years ago because of a single article in the Wall Street Journal that was highlighting these studies where the leading scientific journals had to publish retractions. And it was pretty rare at that time. Now it's actually so common, somebody has gone ahead and put up a website just to track retractions. So if you're reading an article, you can then go to this database and double check to make sure that that research has not been retracted so that you do not use it in your own research. And so from that standpoint, the academic part of that of being retracted and people misleading. And then there's also corporate research or innovators who are knowing there's issues with their products and letting them go on and letting them be released. Boeing with the 737 MAX, and the fact that there's emails from people internal to the organization saying, whoa, I tried to fly this in a simulator and this thing has got some challenges, and nobody doing anything, totally ignoring it, right? So if you think about this whole unethical, misleading information, whether it's Theranos as a startup, whether it's academic research being retracted, or whether it's corporate research innovators knowing there's an issue and going ahead and letting that innovation go out into the marketplace. So that's one area for me. It's that unethical innovation area. Second area is stolen IP. Now, I hear this all the time. I meet with a lot of startup companies, and their biggest fear is they're going to come in and they're going to show a big company some new idea or some innovation or some intellectual property that they have, and then all of a sudden it gets stolen. Now, I can tell you at HP, we had all kinds of safeguards in place to make sure that those things did not happen. But I can tell you that I've heard some real horror stories of companies intentionally stealing IP from other companies. And it's not just the little guys, it's also the big guys. The big guys are doing it also. And so, and again, it's just as, rather than doing their own R&D, someone else has a really great idea, they just steal the idea. Now, there's companies stealing IP from small companies, there's big companies stealing IP from big companies, right? And again, it's all about avoiding the need to do R&D, right? It's basically a budget line item saving strategy, I'm guessing, because other than that, I can't rationalize or figure out why someone would do it. But then there's also individuals, employees who are misappropriating IP. We've seen some cases where people have downloaded IP from the current employer and took it with them to their new employer. Now, some of that can be accidental, meaning historically I had it downloaded and totally forgot that I had that USB stick. So I don't want to paint everybody in the same brush, but in some cases it was intentional, and you can see where it was intentional, and therefore stolen IP. And then the third area is lack of transparency. Just as the financial reforms required audits, there's a clear lack of transparency when it comes to investment returns. GAAP accounting was put in place to make sure that everybody counted the same number the same way so that you could compare company A to company B. There is no way to do that in the innovation world. I can't look at IBM and look at HP and look at Apple and look at Qualcomm and take a look and equate out innovation value across those four companies. So, and the other challenge is current GAAP accounting practices do not give full credit to encourage R&D and high-risk investments. Companies and leaders who want to make those big, long-term, multi-year or even decade-level bets actually get penalized with our current accounting systems and at Wall Street. And this is becoming a big challenge. It's actually causing companies to drive to a much shorter term innovation, and society will be negatively impacted by this. And this lack of transparency, the investors can't compare. This is probably one of my most frustrating areas, having been the CTO at Hewlett Packard, my involvement in advising, coaching, and mentoring Fortune 100 leaders, CEOs, and CTOs, and heads of innovation around the globe, is this issue of this lack of transparency. How company A looks at it is completely different from company B, and the current accounting systems and investors and Wall Street all think about it differently, or they do not think of innovation at all, and there's no recognition for it. There's no way to attach intangible value related to innovation. So these are the three areas for me: ethical of innovation, the stolen IP, the lack of transparency. Those are the three areas for innovation reform that I'm kind of starting off. There's probably a whole number of other areas you may have your own, but these are the three: ethical, stolen, and transparency being the three areas. So how do we address these issues? What are the best way to address these issues? What are your options to address these issues? And what do we need to do as a society to encourage innovation in order to solve the biggest challenges that we're facing? If we don't find a way to solve this, the innovation investment will not happen. But we'll continue these conversations more after the break. So how do we reform innovation? How do we reform innovation to address the three items I've identified? Unethical innovation, stolen IP, or sometimes I'll refer to that as stolen innovation, and transparency. So let's tackle the first one first. Unethical innovation. So here's my proposal. We should establish a code of ethics similar to the medical doctors, the Hippocratic Oath for innovation. Do no harm, do the work to the best of your ability, protect IP, be transparent and honest with your research and test results, what I refer to as share all, and a variety of other things. But basically, define an oath for innovation such that engineers and product managers, etc., recognize that innovation can be used for good, it can also be used for harm. So in the case of the Hippocratic Oath, just like medicine can be used for good or medicine can be used for harm, the Hippocratic Oath for innovation would be do no harm, do the work to the best of your ability, protect IP. If you're an employee, protect your employer's IP, don't steal it, don't steal from somebody else's. You know, if companies ask you to steal IP from somebody else, that's a violation of the oath. Be transparent and honest with your research and test results. Share all. Don't manipulate that data. Be transparent. Share the raw data on all your research to let others validate to make sure that there's nothing strange going on. Now, the real question is okay, so what happens if someone violates this oath? Well, in the case of doctors, what do? They lose their license to practice medicine, right? They're no longer doctors if they violate the Hippocratic Oath. For innovators, there needs to be more than the typical cannot be an officer of a public company for X number of years. That is kind of the standard slap on the wrist that the Securities and Exchange Commission issues if you are found to be in fraud or violation of some significant manner, is that you cannot be an officer of a public company for X number of years. It is amazing how fast someone can go on to raise more funds after a major ethical failing. It's shocking. Now, I'm not talking about normal business failings. You know, they all do. Look, I did 13 startups before Telligent. Well, actually, Telligent was number 13. So I did 12. Some of those got acquired, like ThumbScan. Some of those, the IP, the intellectual property got sold off and the company was shut down. That was Terraplex. You know, I can rattle off all the companies that I've been involved in over the years, right? You're going to have some things that work out, some that don't. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about malfeasance, fraud, unethical behavior. There needs to be something more than just the slap on the wrist. You cannot be an officer of a public company. So how would you disincentivize investors? How would you warn investors off not to back people who violated the Hippocratic Oath? So if you had a doctor, he violated the Hippocratic Oath, he gets his license taken away, how do you disincentivize people to go to that doctor, right? How do you disincentivize that doctor from continuing to practice medicine? Well, he cannot practice medicine. He's in violation. He goes to jail, right? The best way for innovators is look, we all need funding. We need money in order to make our ideas real. So the best way to deal with this is to disincentivize investors. So if an investor, private, public, venture capital, etc., invests with an individual or an individual part of a team who violated the oath, they lose out on tax benefits such as capital gains. If you get somebody that's totally unethical and you want to invest, you know, God bless you. If you still want to invest, go in eyes wide open. But we disincentivize by not allowing those investors to take advantage of things like capital gains. And when you take away the capital gains, that actually increases the taxes. I would argue to take that increased tax collection from the loss of capital gains, it should go to pay back those who suffered the loss from the fraud. So take away whatever incentives. It's capital gains in the U.S. They have something similar in Canada. They've got a similar thing in the U.K. You know, whatever the mechanism is where you live, disincentivize the investors from stepping in and continue to back people who are just unethical innovators, right? The other one that I would take away, again here in the United States, is I would take away the option to declare bankruptcy. They can wipe out the debt. They can raise billions of dollars by just flat out lying or misrepresenting the technology or causing harm to people, and then they can go scot-free by declaring bankruptcy, right? Fraud, no option to go bankrupt. That would keep people from even thinking about doing a fraudulent act because of the personal risk to them. If you're fine and business blows up or whatever, that's fine. Bankruptcy still applies. But if you commit fraud, malfeasance, then there should be some way to incentivize people not to do it. So that's one proposal for the unethical innovation. The other is stolen innovation, stolen IP. Now, this could be a variation of just breaking the oath. If someone or an org is found to have stolen IP, then there should be some form of consequences, similar to the above. One example is in the case of the United States again, is the loss of the R&D tax credit for the years the stolen IP was used. Why? Because this would incentivize organizations to boost their R&D spend rather than steal IP. If you do the right thing and you make the investments, the government should encourage you to invest that money in R&D, in innovation. If you choose to do something illegal, you should lose that benefit. If it was an individual, then the fall is a violation of the oath, and therefore securing funding is hampered by giving the investor who want to back you to lose some financial benefit. So again, it kind of falls into a little bit of the Hippocratic Oath for innovation, but that's where my thinking is, both on unethical innovation and in stolen IP. The last one, lack of transparency. To encourage organizations to fund and invest in innovation, there needs to be some form of incentives, similar to posting the profits and losses that occur in quarterly results. Look, people wait for the quarterly results to come out to know if they hit their number. Therefore, then that's going to mean there's going to be more profits and maybe a higher dividend, and the stock price jumps a couple of points the next morning. That's all great. Where's the correlation in innovation? Where are the shareholders saying, something? You said you were going to spend $1 billion in R&D and you only spent $800 million. That's a negative. You're not spending enough, so therefore your stock price should go down, right? There's none of that correlation or none of that discussion around R&D and innovation. And the current GAAP standards, along with Wall Street, actually discourage investments in innovation unless you can do it on a quarterly basis, right? And I've talked about this before. I had my history at HP where Mark Hurd, when he was CEO, would actually cut back on R&D in order to make sure he could hit the quarterly numbers. And that was probably my biggest heartburn issue and my one regret, wishing that I had fought harder in order to not let that happen as the CTO. So what should change? Well, one is I would create a set of GAAP reporting requirements that give insight into the value of innovation created by the organization. The current standard of R&D as a percentage of revenue is absolutely meaningless. So here's some ideas. Patents awarded and lost, meaning a patent is canceled or retracted, meaning it was a bad patent in the last quarter, along with patent quality. I've got a bunch of articles on patent quality. You can find those over at Killer Innovations. You can look at gross margin impact from innovation, or what we call the innovation premium. You can do intangible value of innovation. That's great too. But through transparency, we want to encourage innovation investment and not leave it up to the renegade leaders who buck the drive for quarterly results and are willing to make long shots. We need more innovation. Now, I'm sure there are other areas where innovation reform can better support innovation. Are there areas you would like to see reformed? What are those? Hop on over to theinnovators.community. That's where we will continue the conversation. I hang out there every day. Post a message up there. Let's get a conversation going about innovation reform. What are those options? Where would we do that innovation reform? Now, after the break, I'll be back with a new episode of 5 Minutes to New Ideas. You're listening to Killer Innovations on the BizTalk Radio Network. Back in the early days of this show, I would share what I called a killer question in each episode. These questions were designed to be used in your personal, team, or organization's innovation efforts. Now, based on feedback from listeners just like you, we've decided to bring it back, with some improvements. Each episode of the Killer Innovations has a segment that I'm now calling 5 Minutes to New Ideas. It's designed for the creative mind looking for that next great idea. Each episode will challenge you to think differently about yourself, your business, and your products and services by asking unique, funny, and sometimes crazy questions. These questions are designed to force you to look beyond the obvious and to uncover ideas and opportunities you never before considered. So, get out your notebook and be ready to uncover that game-changing idea. Here is 5 Minutes to New Ideas. My grandfather had an old saying when I was growing up: never, ever burn a bridge. At the time, I thought it was a strange saying. It was only later that I realized what he was really saying. No matter how someone treats you, do not get angry and never retaliate as to destroy the relationship. Great leaders keep cool even when the attacker is making it personal. The president of a large corporation was confronted by an employee who stormed into his office and said, "I have a thing or two to say to you." He then angrily poured out his complaints and pent-up feelings. As he did so, the president calmly listened. The employee was surprised that he didn't get more of a reaction. And when he was finished, the president said a simple, "Thank you." The president had wisely remained cool like Solomon, the writer of Proverbs, who said, "A gentle tongue is a tree of life." Emerson made the same point when he wrote, "Keep cool and you command everybody." The person who winds up in charge is the one who can remain calm and in control under the most intense pressure. There are strengths and power in stillness and quietness. It is the most universally important quality of great leaders. They are unflappable. Leaders know that they do not make the best decisions when made with emotions or in the heat of anger. If a person can learn to remain calm in situations of stress, they have discovered one of a leader's most valuable lessons, one that the vast majority of people never learn. Earlier in my career, I was on a trip overseas when I saw two drivers whose trucks came face to face in a narrow street. Neither would back up to let the other by. So what'd they do? They started blowing their horns and yelling profanities at each other. After a few minutes of watching this spectacle, I went on to my meeting. When I returned a few hours later, they were in the exact same place, still blocking each other, red in the face, yelling at each other. I wonder if they are still there. They were the perfect representations of what happens when anger and emotion overcome reason. Nothing constructive happens. Logic says that when they had first seen each other, one of them should have immediately backed up and both could have been on their way. While it is easy to point out the flaws in others, we need to recognize when we have fallen short. My mom, a fellow redhead like me, said I got a double helping of the redheaded temper. To emphasize the point, she would tell me this story. There was once a little boy who had a bad temper. His mother gave him a bag of nails and told him that every time he lost his temper, he must hammer a nail back in the fence. The first day, the boy had driven 37 nails into the fence. Over the next few weeks, as he learned to control his anger, the number of nails hammered each day gradually dwindled down. He discovered it was easier to hold his temper than to drive those nails into the fence. Finally, the day came when the boy didn't lose his temper at all. She then instructed him to pull out one nail for each day he was now able to hold his anger. The days passed, and the young boy was able to tell his mother that all the nails were gone. The mother took his son by the hand and led them to the fence. She said, "You have done well, but look at the holes in the fence. The fence will never be the same. When you say things in anger, they leave a scar just like the holes in the fence. It won't matter how many times you say you're sorry, the holes are still there." The little boy then understood how powerful his words were. He looked up at his mother and said, "I hope you can forgive me, Mother, for the holes I put in you. Of course I can, said the mother. Every day I strive to follow my grandfather's warning to stay calm, don't get angry, and never ever burn a bridge, no matter how someone acts, says, or treats me. Keep cool, and you command everyone. Emerson was right. Even a youngster who keeps his composure in the face of raving parents makes them look ridiculous. I'm Phil McKinney, and thanks for listening. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join in. If you have any comments or suggestions, drop me a note at phil@killerinnovations.com. Beyond this show, I write about my personal experiences of being in the innovation game for the last 2 decades. Topics include innovation, creativity, culture, team building, metrics, frustrations, leadership, and how to win. You can find that content over at philmckinney.com. You can also find out information about my book, Beyond the Obvious, including extensive excerpts over at beyondtheobvious.com. You can find hardcover, digital, and audio versions of my book on Amazon or wherever you get your books from. Now, the reason I started this show back in 2005 was to pay back my early mentor. My first mentor, Bob Davis, invested an immense amount of time in training and coaching me, which had a major impact on my career. When I went back and asked him how I could pay him back, he laughed and said I couldn't. I had to pay it forward. If I could ask for a favor, could you help me pay it forward? How? 1, by giving us a rating wherever you get your podcast, as that helps spread the word. And 2, by telling others about the show. If you want to be part of the conversation between the shows, I hang out in the Innovators community on Slack. The Innovators community is a private community of vetted innovators who help each other succeed. Check it out at theinnovators.community. This episode of Killer Innovations was produced by the Innovators Network. You can find the show notes and the entire show catalog going back to 2005 at killerinnovations.com. I'll talk to you next week, and in the meantime, go out and change the world with your killer innovation. Bye-bye.